Letter 17 focuses on the idea of gluttony, and whenever someone refers to gluttony, it doesn't always have to be about food. It can be anything that you do in excess. But in Letter 17, C.S. Lewis particularly focuses on the idea of food when it comes to gluttony. Letter 17. My dear Wormwood, the contemptuous way in which you spoke of gluttony as a mean of catching souls in your last letter only shows your ignorance. One of the greatest achievements of the last 100 years has been to deaden the human conscience on that subject, so that by now you will hardly find a sermon preached or a conscience troubled about it in the whole length and breadth of Europe. Here, Screwtape advises Wormwood, look, this idea of gluttony and putting the idea of gluttony into your patient's head really isn't like the best idea because people are basically immune to it now. Like everyone knows the idea of gluttony, they get it, they know not to overindulge. So this isn't always like the best tactic to use with your patient. This has largely been affected by concentrating all our efforts on gluttony of delicacy, not gluttony of excess. Your patient's mother, as I have learned from the dossier you might have learned from Glubgos, is a good example. She would be astonished, one day I hope, will be, to learn that her whole life is enslaved to this kind of sensuality, which is quite concealed from her by the fact that the quantities involved are small. We learn here that the patient's mother, one of her chief temptations, sins is gluttony, but it's not gluttony of excess, it's gluttony of delicacy, and he's going to explain that to us here. But what do quantities matter, provided that we can use a human belly and palate to produce complaining, impatience, uncharitableness, and self-concern? Glubos has this old woman well in hand. She's a positive terror to hostesses and servants. So whenever this woman goes to a restaurant and goes to someone's house, she's just horrifying to deal with. And that made me think of quote unquote, Karens of today, right? These people who always have a comment to make, always have a complaint to make, so on and so forth. She is always turning from what has been offered her to say with a demure little sigh and smile, oh, please, please, all I want is a cup of tea, weak but not too weak, and the teeniest weeniest bit of really crisp toast. You see, because what she wants is smaller and less costly than what has been set before her, she never recognizes as gluttony her determination to get what she wants, however troublesome it may be to others. At the very moment of indulging her appetite, she believes that she is practicing temperance. In a crowded restaurant, she gives a little scream at a plate which some overworked waitress has set before her and says, oh, that's far, far too much. Take it away and bring me about a quarter of it. If challenged, she would say she was doing this to avoid waste. In reality, she does it because the particular shade of delicacy to which we have enslaved her is offended by the sight of more food than she happens to want. The real value of the quiet, unobtrusive work which Glubos has been doing for years on this old woman could be gauged by the way in which her belly now dominates her whole life. So even though she wants the smallest portions and so forth and so on, the fact is that food still rules her life. So this is the gluttony of delicacy. The gluttony of excess is when you eat too much. The gluttony of delicacy is when you're focused on having the smallest portions and making sure that you don't eat too much. But here C.S. Lewis is making the argument that both are gluttony because in both instances your life is revolving around food and all of your time is spent thinking about food. The woman is in what many may call an all-I-want state of mind. All she wants is a cup of tea properly made, or an egg properly boiled, or a slice of bread properly toasted. But she never finds any servant or any friend who can do these simple things properly, because her properly conceals an insatiable demand for the exact and almost impossible palatable pleasures which she imagines she remembers from the past, a past described by her as the days when you could get good servants, but known to us as the days when her senses were more easily pleased and she had pleasures of other kinds which made her less dependent on those of the table. Meanwhile, the daily disappointment produces daily ill temper. Cooks give notice and friendships are cooled. If ever the enemy introduces into her mind a faint suspicion that she is too interested in food, Glubos counters it by suggesting to her that she doesn't mind what she eats herself, but does like to have things nice for her boy. In fact, of course, her greed has been one of the chief sources of his domestic discomfort for many years. Now, your patient is his mother's son. While working your hardest, quite rightly, on other fronts, you must not neglect a little quiet infiltration in respect of gluttony. Being a male, he is not so likely to be caught by the all I want camouflage. Males are best turned into gluttons with the help of their vanity. They ought to be made to think themselves very knowing about food, to pique themselves on having found the only restaurant in town where steaks are really properly cooked. What begins as vanity can then be gradually turned into habit. But, however you approach it, the great thing is to bring him into the state into which the denial of any one indulgence, it matters not which, champagne or tea, sokolbe or cigarettes, puts him out, for then his charity, justice, and obedience are all at your mercy. Mere excess in food is much less valuable than delicacy. Its chief use is of a kind of artillery preparation for attacks on chastity. On that end, as on every other subject, keep your man in a condition of false spirituality. Never let him notice the medical aspect. Keep him wondering what pride or lack of faith has delivered him into your hands, when a simple inquiry into what he has been eating or drinking for the last 24 hours would show him whence your ammunition comes, and thus enable him by very little abstinence to imperil your lines of communication. If he must think of the medical side of chastity, feed him the grand lie which we have made the English humans believe, that physical exercise and excess and consequent fatigue are specially favorable to this virtue. How they can believe this in face of the notorious lustfulness of sailors and soldiers may well be asked, but we use the schoolmasters to put the story about. Men who were really interested in chastity as an excuse for games, and therefore recommended games as an aid to chastity. This whole business is too large to deal with at the tail end of a letter. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So that last paragraph is kind of weird, and I would basically just ignore it. But the overall idea of this letter is the idea of gluttony, and whether you're focused on eating too little or you're focused on eating too much. Are our lives revolving too much around food, and therefore we're not focusing on the more important things?